Hello, everybody. This is your Gaza war update, SITREP day 130. I know many of you watch this just for John Elmer. He's not here today. He's preparing for the live stream tomorrow. You can catch him on the electronic live stream, in the Electronic Intifada live stream tomorrow to do those breakdowns. And he'll be back probably next video on this channel. So a couple of things to talk about today. The main one being Hassan Nasrallah's speech, when Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah, makes a speech. We have to break it down. And Nasrallah made a speech today. He made a speech this morning commemorating the Martyrs' Day of Resistance. Talked a lot about people injured over the course of members of the resistance that were injured. So he had a number of points. I mean, I thought that the overall theme of the speech was, hold on, hang in there. This war is not over. It could go on for a long time, and he was signaling to the resistance that Hezbollah would be with them until the end. So that's the signal for the resistance side. Was he said this is going to go on, as we will keep this front open while the aggression in Gaza lasts. Period. Everything else he's made this point before. Everything else can be negotiated about, but not that. And he said, you can threaten us, even you can attack Lebanon, but we are not going to back off of this. And then he said that more or less to Israel and to the resistance. He made a number of rebukes to the resistance side, specifically about security culture, which was interesting. He said, basically, please don't use your mobile phones in border villages. Please don't use them because they are, assume they have the phones, right? Assume they've got our phones. Mobile phones are lethal informants providing specific and deadly information. And he also said, please don't connect your cameras if they're facing outwards. Please don't connect your security cameras to the internet. If you have these cameras connected to the internet, it says it's better than having drones and all these other kinds of surveillance. So those were for the resistance's side. And then probably the most quotable quote from Nasrallah was when he said directly to the Israeli, defense minister, he said, if you do start a war against us, instead of 100,000 displaced people in the north, you will have 2 million displaced from the north, which I guess is, 40+% of Israel's Jewish population. So that was Nasrallah's speech. And the other thing, whenever Nasrallah gives a speech, I always go to the Twitter feed of Professor Amal Saad. I've mentioned her before. She's the author of the book Hezbollah, Politics and Religion. And she said she had this thread. I'll share it with you. You can take a look. She said, an important part of Nasrallah's speech today was how the people of South Lebanon, particularly those in the frontline villages, continue to support the party's solidarity campaign with Gaza. This is evidenced by the social media of Hezbollah's supporters who fully support its military campaign, as well as its refusal to cede to any of Israel's demands, such as moving its forces north of the Litani or stopping attacks. There's a joke that I saw circulating today that apparently Hezbollah supporters say, if you want Hezbollah to move north of the river, then you're going to have to move the river to the border, because Hezbollah is not moving from the border. Amal Saad continues, despite the grave personal costs to Hezbollah's constituency, the overwhelming majority are willing to make these sacrifices, partly because of their solidarity with the Palestinians and partly because they view Gaza's security as tied with Lebanon's, which makes a lot of sense. Israel is not going to treat Lebanese people with any less genocidal contempt than they treat Palestinians, and that's been evident from the wars on Lebanon. And if Israel gets a chance, there's every reason to think they'll do this. They would do the same thing to Lebanese people, civilians specifically. I don't know if on yesterday's breakdown we talked about the so-called Houthis, Nasrallah. They hit another ship, the Star Iris, with anti-ship missiles, and there was a speech by the leader of Nasrallah, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and he was basically refuting the idea that what kind of a misinformation that's going around, that the Houthis are planning to target undersea internet cables. And he said, we're not trying to target internet cables destined for regional countries. Our escalation of tension is solely against Israel, the US, England, in support of the Zionists. So he, they brought the leader out to try to clarify this. I want to talk about Gaza. I want to talk about the fighting in Gaza, and then the Israel front and what's going on in terms of Western racism and the ongoing moral deterioration of the entire Western states and their system. So as far as fighting, we talked about a big attack in Khan Yunis, where a big number of Israelis was killed, according to the resistance, at least 10. There was another anti-personnel explosive device. There was shelling of command and control positions, an ambush, battlefield injuries, shelling, destroying of a vehicle, and then the ongoing fighting on the Lebanon border. That was yesterday. And then today, the summary of today's fighting, another attack of 7 soldiers in Khan Yunis, an anti-personnel mine hitting 5 soldiers inside a building in Khan Yunis, seized a drone in Gaza City, hit an armored personnel carrier with a Yasin 105 in Khan Yunis, detonated 3 booby-trapped tunnel entrances, Khan Yunis, targeted a Merkava tank and a military bulldozer in Khan Yunis, detonated a pre-rigged building, causing casualties in Khan Yunis. Shelling in Khan Yunis, just an immense amount of fighting in Khan Yunis and around Khan Yunis. And so Khan Yunis being, central South Gaza, and you've probably seen and heard all about the ongoing attacks in Rafah by the Israelis, bombing civilian targets and bombing people in tents, bombing people in cars. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the Israel side of things, because there are a few interesting things to talk about in terms, again, of the deterioration on that front. Probably worth stopping in Germany. The Germans have had some kind of parade, some kind of racist parade against Palestinians, and many people have pointed out that this is basically just classic German anti-Semitic imagery and celebration, just swapping the Palestinians out where the Jews would have been in their otherwise, unchanged anti-Semitic tropes. As far as Israel goes, there is a lot of effort at the grassroots level in Israel going to trying to stop Palestinians from having food. So here's Israeli soldiers posting a video showing the destruction and burning of food warehouses in Gaza City. We have also a Washington Post story, young Israelis block aid to Gaza while IDF soldiers stand and watch. Every explosion in Gaza raises a cheer. The Reporter says, dead, dead, dead Arabs. One camper shouts at a roaring valley of outgoing fire. Then she notices the presence of a reporter. Sorry, Hamas. She corrects herself. So that's another one. Let's see what else we've got. We've got a rave. We've got a rave, people dancing. So it's a rave to block humanitarian aid. So Israel, they don't just block the humanitarian aid, they hold a dance party to block the humanitarian aid. We have people dancing, waving Israeli flags, DJs, music, all in the name of preventing humanitarian aid from getting to starving people. We have a kind of a convoy. I'll show you the convoy. Someone's driving past this entire convoy as it to show the length, and the caption here: a substantial crowd of extremist Israelis are heading to the Nitzana border crossing with Egypt to prevent aid trucks from entering Gaza. I don't know the extent of evil and sickness in a person who tries to starve another human being and finds joy in watching them die. So that's that's how the humanitarian situation is being viewed and handled on the Israeli side. One last point about food. There was a story in Haaretz, published in Hebrew, not English, this commentator says, about an article about a lifestyle cooking feature about Israeli soldiers finding and cooking with ingredients in the kitchens of Gazans who had to flee their homes and are now starving. We are cooking with mixed emotions. In every home in Gaza, we found olives, olive oil, and lots of spices. We are cooking with mixed emotions. We decided to turn the food into a place of sanity for us. They made bruschetta a la Gaza to eat well in an organized and planned way, while around there's a storm raging. Rice and curry from India, a war meal. We understood that it's possible to take part in campaigns and yet eat well, and this became the story of our unit. We sat and ate, people smiled and forgot about the distress for a moment. There's also an importance to the rounded metal trays and so on. So there's a virtual buffet of information about stolen food, stealing the food from starving people and holding a party and making videos cooking that food. So we also have an update on how many Palestinians are being held hostage. Zack Foster, kind of a historian, I shouldn't say kind of, a historian, an academic who studies the Middle East. He has a big Twitter feed, and he talked about how Israel's holding 3,484 Palestinians hostage, known as administrative detainees. They have not been told why they were taken. Israel is holding 32 times as many hostages as Hamas. So that, I think, and then the one last major thing about the Israel front, which is about the possible, and I have not seen another source, it all comes from this one source, they're sort of blaming Netanyahu for this, but apparently Netanyahu has rejected a ceasefire proposal made by his own intelligence and military agencies. So this is the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the IDF formulated a new outline for the release of hostages, which was rejected by Netanyahu. Let's continue translating the Hebrew on this. The outline came up several times in talks with the prime minister. The outline included changes in several parameters. Netanyahu, to the dismay of the head of Mossad, the head of Shin Bet, and the person in charge of the issue, finally rejected the presentation of the new outline and ordered the team to travel anyway to listen. So a political source said that the problem was and remains the unreasonable demands of Hamas to stop the war. After the plan was rejected, Major General Nitzan Alon, who is in charge of the abductee issue on behalf of the IDF, decided not to go to Cairo. So I don't know what this is. I always suspect that there's some kind of theatrics going on, and maybe the idea is to pin the lack of success on Netanyahu. But maybe it could just be true. One of the possibilities is always that it's just being reported as it happened, and that Netanyahu himself is at least more intransigent about continuing the war than the military organizations themselves. It's possible. Now, I wanted to talk about Egypt today. I wanted to talk about some more about Egypt's history. And I wanted to talk about it in the context of trying to understand why Egypt is not, there's no meaningful prospect of Egypt joining or helping the resistance against Israel. And that's kind of it shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be hard for Egypt to contribute in some way, considering that Egypt is 10 times the size of Israel, and has vastly more capacity than Israel, and has fought multiple wars with Israel, and yet is now an accomplice to everything that is happening in Gaza, and has been for decades now. And why is that? How does that make sense? How is that possible? And I didn't fully understand this until relatively recently. And I recommended a book by Hazem Kandil called Soldiers, Spies and Statesmen once. And I actually read a couple of other books since then. Last time I talked about, let me just give you one last piece of current news to situate this historical discussion that I'm about to do, which is that at this exact moment, Egypt is helping. You remember that Nasrallah has an effective blockade of the Red Sea against Israel, and Egypt is currently helping Israel bypass Nasrallah. There are ships departing from Egypt and heading to Israeli port of Ashdod, and so that's what Egypt's doing. Like, in the middle of all of this, Egypt is doing that. So how is that possible? Why is that happening? And Hazem Kandil's book has the key, and the key, as always, is history. It's in how Egypt has evolved specifically since the 1970s. And spoiler alert, what happened in the 1970s leading up to 1973 and since is that the president that followed the death of Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was the president that took Egypt to independence and nationalized the Suez Canal and fought a couple of wars against Israel, 1956 and 1967, and died in 1970. So there's a bit of after various intrigues, which is what Hazem Kandil writes about. He writes about, you may remember from a couple of videos ago, that you can think of Egypt as a military dictatorship, but that's slightly too simple. What Egypt is a regime where there are several power bases, and one is the security system, the police system, and the military is a separate system. And those two systems fight each other for power. And then much weaker, business community, civil society, etc. But it's really, and then within the police and military factions, there are factions within the factions, but you have to understand two different fountains of power, one being the police apparatus and the other being the military apparatus. And Hazem Kandil argues that 2011, the military took over from the police apparatus, and nonetheless, the pattern so Nasser dies, Anwar Sadat ends up winning the little Game of Thrones, let's say, that gets him in charge. And what he sets about doing, and this was what Kandil says, is if you analyze Anwar Sadat's actions in terms of Egypt's economic development, in terms of Egypt's military development, in terms of Egypt's status in the world, in terms of Egypt's power and influence in the region, it is utterly disastrous. Sadat is just an unmitigated and total disaster on all of those fronts. However, if you analyze Sadat in terms of his ability to stay in power through over 10 plus years until he's assassinated, in the face of all these different intrigues that would have him overthrown, well, then he's a pretty impressive player. And so that is the story of Sadat. And Sadat basically, to do that, to ensure his own position, he transformed Egypt until it was unrecognizable and built total submission to the United States into into the DNA of the Egyptian state, to such an extent that it's very, very difficult to imagine how that could be changed on any timeline that matters. So Kandil describes how Sadat, from when he came to power, he was trying to win over the United States, and he tried to approach different people. He tried to approach the ambassadors. He tried to make friends with the Rockefeller family. He tried to appease the Secretary of State, and then he eventually came to try to ingratiate himself with Kissinger. And so he ended up having a direct line to Henry Kissinger himself. And Henry Kissinger, during the war, I mean, Kissinger's strategy for Israel was to create the following setup. Kissinger wanted everybody in the Arab world to understand two things. One, Israel is too strong to be defeated by all its neighbors combined. And two, the US is the key to the Middle East. And so Kissinger is so pleased with himself for getting Sadat and kind of manipulating Sadat. And Sadat is so eager to be manipulated. The book describes how Sadat he told his soldiers, and one notable commander, Saad El-Shazly, who has two books, one book about the 1973 war, crossing the Suez, and another one called The Arab Military Option. I got both. I read in both, and The Arab Military Option has some interesting passages which I may read to you in this video if time permits. So Sadat, he told his soldiers to get ready for a war to liberate the territories that Israel had occupied, the Egyptian territory, the Sinai Peninsula that Israel had occupied in 1967. And he told them to get ready to do it. They got ready to do it in good faith. Shazly made a plan. He got the troops ready, and they started the attack on October 6th, 1973. So there's some anniversary elements to what happened on October 7th. He made the attack, but Sadat secretly didn't want the attack to be too successful. He didn't want any commanders to emerge with a lot of prestige from the war, and he didn't want to upset the United States or Israel by having too much success. So the plan was to take these key mountain passes, the Midi and Gavati passes. I think that's what they're called, Midi, and there are two important mountain passes. And I talked to you about them before. There was a race to these passes. The commanders wanted to go to these passes, and after they crossed the canal, the Sadat told them to hold before they got to those key objectives. And they spread out, and Syria had attacked at the same time. I'm just gonna search for this mountain pass in Egypt, and there's the Gidi Pass, and there's some other pass. Anyway, there's these two passes. I've talked about them before. And if you control those mountain passes, then you have a very defensible position. And in the 1967 war, the commanders wanted to retreat to those positions, and their military leader, Amer, who was purged and poisoned after that war, he ordered them not to stop there and keep retreating. And this time Anwar Sadat told them not to take those passes, not to advance up until that point, and to wait. And then Israel was able to destroy basically the Syrian attack, basically stop the Syrian attack, because Anwar Sadat was calling Henry Kissinger every day and assuring him that Egypt was not going to advance beyond the east bank of the Suez Canal. It's the first time someone said, one of the Egyptian officers said, this is the first time in history when the one side told the enemy in detail their dispensations and their intentions. He's never seen that before. And it's true. It's totally weird, because Kissinger was using all of that information, feeding it to the Israelis and helping them coordinate what to do. So, okay, we know Egypt is not going to advance. We can concentrate on Syria, deal with the Syrian attack, and then patiently allow the United States to refit this famous airlift of 25,000 tons of material, and then another 33,000 tons by sea. I roughly calculate that the US has sent 20,000 tons to Israel just to drop bombs on Gaza in the past 4 months. So this airlift of the US to destroy Gaza is getting comparable to the airlift they did to save Israel from this Egyptian attack. So Sadat coordinated with Kissinger, sacrificed his own army, allowed the Third Army to get encircled by Israel, allowed Israel the time to refit, didn't take the passes, and then basically frittered away the entire all the advantages that they had. So that was how the 1973 war went. And it got to the point where the Soviet Union was so concerned that they threatened America if Israel didn't honor the ceasefire, that they would get involved. And Anwar Sadat told the Soviet Union to back off. Anwar Sadat told the Soviet Union to stay out of it. He was too busy trying to surrender enough that they would accept the surrender, and they didn't. And I in my memory, I thought that Sadat was the one who got the Sinai back, but it's not true. The Sinai was the Israelis finally withdrew in 1982 after Sadat was assassinated. So it's not just not getting the Sinai back. Sadat signed these accords with Israel. He went to Israel directly. He recognized Israel. He also broke the relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union, the military arms and advice, and made Egypt subordinate to Israeli. It made Egyptian arms procurement, basically they gave the monopoly contract to the United States. So now the United States supplies Egypt more or less exclusively. I mean, there are European suppliers under the umbrella of the US, and the US was committed to making sure that Egypt did not have enough weapons, would ever have enough weapons to challenge Israel. Whatever Israel had, Egypt was given inferior versions. Israel was taught and had American experts to use it. Egypt was not. And Egypt became like kind of a subcontractor. Egypt also agreed to go and interfere in the Afghan war in the 80s. So they trained a battalion to go and destroy the Afghan government, the Islamist, the Mujahideen. What else did they do? They gave the US rights to train desert warfare troops on Egyptian territory, which they wanted to do, and they used against Iraq. They were what else did they do? Finances. There's a financial issue. So everybody talks about how the United States gives Egypt 1.3 billion in military aid, but in fact, Egypt is deeply in debt to US institutions and banks. The arms contracts with the Soviet Union were very modest in terms of debt, and the Soviet Union had a kind of a solidaristic view of third world armies where they would roll the debt over, reschedule the debt, and so on. The United States, of course, expects payment in cash and dollars. So the debt within 20 years of loans to the Soviet Union brought a fraction of the debt to Egypt that the US had. Okay, here's one. 1971, Egypt's debt amounted to 1.3 billion, but was mostly allocated to strategic projects and the importing of strategic goods. Merely a decade later, in 1981, civilian debt had jumped to 19.5 billion and military debt to 5.7 billion. Sadat's 10-year tenure increased Egypt's foreign debt 10 times, 3/4 of it to financing consumption. And they deindustrialized Egypt in this era as well. Imported Egyptian imports, there were 33% of all Egyptian imports were from the US, and Egyptian exports to the US were 8% of total Egyptian exports, and most of it was oil. So they gave their economy, they gave their military, Sadat gave it all to the US. And why? Because, again, this is Hazem Kandil's thesis, but it makes a lot of sense. Nasser, the previous Egyptian president, had he'd come to power with the military, but then he had this conflict with the military commander Amr, who was this horribly incompetent military commander who was mainly responsible for the 1967 catastrophic loss of that war. And then there was all these intrigues between Nasser's security apparatus, his attempt to rely on a democratic party structure, and then the military and the military loyalists. And then, so what Sadat's scheme was, I'm going to have the security apparatus, and I'm not going to try to have a democratic party structure, and I'm going to marginalize the military, and I'm going to do it all through having an external patron and choosing that patron to be the United States. And there's an incredible quote where Sadat talks about the Sha of Iran, and I'm going to try to find it because it's incredible. He says the Shah. Okay, here it is. Sadat spelled out his strategy in a private conversation with Ahmed Baldin, a longtime acquaintance and editor of the daily newspaper Al-Ahram, who had just returned from a visit to Tehran in 1974. So Sadat says this: you know, for a long time, I've considered the Sha of Iran my role model among third world leaders. Your non-aligned leaders whose clamor had occupied the world for years, Nehru, Nkrumah, Sukarno, even Nasser, even Tito, who's still alive. Where are they now? Some died, some were defeated, some were overthrown, and some shrank in their borders like Tito. Only one member of this generation remains on his throne, with all its power and glory, with the whole world seeking his friendship. This is the Sha of Iran, and the reason is simple. While all those other leaders believe the world has two great powers, Russia and America, and tried to deal with them on par, this could not be further from the truth. There is only one great power, which is America. Russia is not even a second great power. It is 10 or 20 steps behind America. It was the Sha of Iran who realized that. What did he do? He sat on America's lap and clutched its gowns. And as you see, while all your friends are gone, America fulfilled the Shah's needs. A revolution erupted in 1953 and he escaped to Italy. The Americans brought him back and installed him again on the throne. That is why I think he is a brilliant and extraordinary man. And when the Shah got overthrown 5 years later, he actually went to Egypt, and he was received as a guest of honor. He spent his last days in Cairo with his admirer Sadat, as Kandil puts it. So it's amazing, someone who modeled themselves on the Sha of Iran, who actually outlasted the Sha of Iran by a couple of years, only to be assassinated himself. The way that Sadat, a couple of other notes from Shazly, like while you're reeling from the shock of what Sadat did, unless the story was familiar to you. It was not to me. I had heard that Sadat had kind of betrayed Syria and deliberately underperformed in 1973. I did not know the extent. I did not know he was calling Kissinger every day and telling him exactly what his troops were going to do so that Kissinger could use that information to help the Israelis kill Egyptian troops on the battlefield and win the war. But there's an interesting passage in General Saad El-Shazly. Saad El-Shazly was actually in the Congo. I wrote a book called The America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I do tell the story of the assassination of Lumumba in 1961, well, very early in 1961. And the United Nations and the terrible role that the United Nations played there. There was an Egyptian battalion in 1960 in the UN, and Saad El-Shazly was there, and he didn't want to continue. His assessment was that we can't continue after Lumumba was assassinated. And I read on the internet somewhere that he helped smuggle the Lumumba's children out of Congo after Lumumba himself was assassinated. So Shazly is a very interesting person. And in the book, The Arab Military Option, the basic thesis of the book is that the only way that the Arab peoples will get their land back from Israel is through a military struggle. He said, we lost it through a military struggle. We can only get it back through a military struggle. We can't negotiate what we can't win on the battlefield. He has a section on the importance of human rights for Arabs, like in Arab countries, and how people won't fight for these countries unless they have their rights. And there's various ideas in here about it, but there's a fascinating thing where he talks about he doesn't think a people's war will work. He says, a people's war has to also go along with a conventional war, for various reasons. He says the terrain is unsuitable for guerrilla warfare, so he did not see the tunnels network in advance. How could he? This book was written in 1986 or so. He says, he compares it to Algeria, Vietnam. He says this is not a situation conducive to guerrilla warfare like those situations. He says something really interesting, though. He says, as long as Egypt adheres to the Camp David Treaty, Egypt can't help the Arab cause. So he wants Egypt to leave that treaty in 1986. But he says something amazing in light of the fact that, in light of what's going on today. This is a fascinating passage, page 190, the Arab military option. He says, Lebanon has never posed a threat to Israel, save when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was stationed in the south of the country. When the PLO was finally expelled from those bases in August 1982, Lebanon once again ceased to be a threat to Israel. Moreover, Lebanon's internal problems are such that Arabs should not expect it to play a significant external role for years to come. The most that can be hoped is that Lebanon will not fall under Israeli domination, and that its territory can somehow be denied to Israel as the route for a flanking attack upon Syria. So that's how he sees Lebanon, which is fascinating. I think it was probably accurate at the time, but wow, did it ever turn out differently than that. He says, time is on the side of the Arabs. Even if we can't get it back this generation, we'll get it back next generation or the one after that. So he's for preparation. He's for long-term thinking, and he's confident over the long term. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this book, The Arab Military Option. It's very interesting to see how people thought about this military problem when the Soviet Union still existed, when all of the powers and all of the when it was still conceivable that Egypt might get back on track somehow. But yeah, so the point of all of this historical discussion of Egypt in the 1973 war and Sadat is to say that Sadat built subordination of every kind, military, financial, economic, to the United States, into the Egyptian state. At some point, maybe I'll finish Hazem Kandil's book and get to his analysis of the 2011 attempt at a revolution. And we'll see how it updates. But for me, seeing the insights of how Sadat transformed the state gave me a lot of understanding of why Egypt is such a non-contributor, such an unhelpful, or such a worse than unhelpful, such a complicit neighbor in this genocide in Gaza. And it's a situation where the resistance, the players that are involved, have to continue to salute Egypt for all of their help and thank them for helping mediate and the various things that they are doing, even though in history, up until the 1973 war, Egypt was the leader of the struggle. Egypt is the natural leader by size and scale and history of the entire Arab world, and that was transformed by Anwar Sadat and his decision to model the state on the Shah of Iran, who was to be overthrown shortly after Sadat remade Egypt in that image. So that's it for tonight. I will we'll see you again either tomorrow night or very soon. Please like and subscribe, and as Nasrallah was trying to say today, hang in there. This is gonna go on for a while.